The stars were dying and nobody could stop it from happening across the galaxy. And Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship called Defiant, watching the emergency broadcasts flood in from every corner of known space, and each message told the same terrible story about worlds falling and civilizations ending, and fleets burning in the darkness of space. And the enemy they called the Krathon Swarm had been unstoppable for 3 long years, now consuming everything in their path. Like locusts made of living metal and hate, Jake was 42 years old and he had seen more death in these 3 years than in his entire military career before, and his face showed it with lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, and his dark hair had gone gray at the temples, and he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the view screen while his crew worked quietly around him, and they all knew what was coming, because Earth Command had sent the order an hour ago, and it was the order everyone feared most. Fall back to Sol System and prepare for final defense and abandon all outer colonies and outposts, and let the aliens fend for themselves, and humanity would make its last stand around Earth and nowhere else. And Jake had read the order 3 times, and each time it felt like swallowing broken glass because it meant giving up. And he had never been good at giving up, even when he probably should. Lieutenant Megan Price stood at the tactical station running calculations on her screen, and she was 29 with sharp eyes and blonde hair pulled back tight, and she had lost her entire family when her homeworld burned 2 years ago. And since then she fought with a cold fury that made her the best tactical officer in the fleet. And she looked up at Jake and said, "Captain, we have an incoming transmission, and it's not from command, and it's a distress call." Jake turned to her and said, "Put it through." And the view screen changed to show a desperate message from the Vaylor homeworld. And the Vaylors were one of the oldest races in the galaxy, with blue skin and 4 arms. And they kept ancient libraries, full of knowledge from civilizations that existed before humans even discovered fire. And now their world was surrounded by Krathon bioships, and their shields were failing, and they were begging for help from anyone who could hear. The bridge went silent, and everyone knew what this meant because the Vaylor system was 3 days away in the opposite direction from Earth, and helping them meant defying direct orders and probably never seeing home again. And Jake looked around at his crew and saw Lieutenant Price at Tactical and Commander Alan Baker, his first officer who was 38 and always followed protocol, and Dr. Henry Cole at the science station who was 56 with white hair and glasses and had spent his whole life studying alien life peacefully until the war made him weaponize his knowledge, and Sergeant Nina Ortiz, who commanded the Marine Detachment and was 34 and built like she could punch through steel. Commander Baker stepped forward and said, "Captain, we have our orders and they are clear and we need to return to Earth," and Jake nodded slowly and said, "You are right, Alan, and those are our orders." But then he looked at the distress call again, playing on repeat, showing Vaylor children crying and cities burning, and he said, "But I did not join the military to abandon people who need help." And Baker opened his mouth to argue, but Jake held up his hand and said, "I am not ordering anyone to come with. Me and anyone who wants to follow orders can take a shuttle back to the nearest human outpost, but I am taking Defiant to Vaylor Prime." The bridge was quiet for maybe 10 seconds, and then Megan Price said, "I am with you, Captain," and she said it without hesitation. And then Dr. Cole said, "Those libraries contain knowledge we might need to fight the swarm, and I will not let them." Byrne and Sergeant Ortiz just grinned and said, "Someone has to keep you officers alive. So count me in," and one by one every single crew member on the bridge volunteered, and even Commander Baker sighed and said, "Well, I cannot let you do this alone, Captain, and you will need someone to keep you from getting us all killed." Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen just a bit, and he said, "Then set course for Vaylor Prime and maximum speed, and give me everything the engines can handle." And the crew moved with renewed purpose, and the Defiant turned away from Earth and toward the Vaylor system, and Jake knew he had just ended his career and probably his life, but some things mattered more than following orders. They traveled through dead space for 2 days, passing the wreckage of alien ships and abandoned space stations, and everywhere they looked, they saw evidence of the swarm's destruction, and Dr. Cole spent those 2 days studying every piece of data they had on the Krathon, looking for any weakness that previous civilizations might have missed. And on the second day, he found something. Cole called Jake to the science lab, and his hands were shaking with excitement as he pulled up data from a derelict alien battlecruiser they had passed. And he said, "Captain, look at this." And the screen showed battle recordings from the ship's final Fight, and Cole said every species fights the swarm the same way with massive energy weapons and coordinated fleet tactics, but the swarm adapts to energy signatures almost instantly, and Cole pointed to a section of data and said, but there is a delay in their adaptation and it's only milliseconds, but it exists, and if we hit them with something they have not adapted to yet and hit them fast enough, we might exploit that delay. Jake studied the data and said, what are you suggesting? Doctor and Cole said the swarm has fought advanced civilizations for years, and they have adapted to every known weapon system, but humans still use kinetic weapons and railguns and missiles, because we are newer to space warfare, and those are considered primitive by galactic standards. And Cole smiled and said, which means the swarm might not have optimized their defenses against them. Jake felt hope for the first time in months, and he called Lieutenant Price to the lab and said, Megan, can you design attack patterns using our kinetic weapons and make them as unpredictable as possible? And Price's eyes lit up, and she said, if the swarm has a reaction delay, we can use hit-and-run tactics and strike from angles they do not expect, and keep them constantly adapting and never let them settle into a pattern. And Jake said, then that is exactly what we will do. On the third day, they arrived at the Valor system, and what they saw made even the most hardened crew members go pale. And there were hundreds of Krathon bioships surrounding the planet, and each one looked like a nightmare made real with organic. Hulls that pulsed and writhed, and weapons that grew from their bodies like tumors, and the planet's shields flickered weakly and would fail within hours, and millions of Valors would die. Jake sat in his command chair and looked at the impossible odds, and his crew looked at him waiting for orders. And he thought about all the worlds that had fallen because nobody stood and fought. And he thought about humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. And he opened a comm channel on all frequencies so that every ship in the system could hear both Krathon and Valor and any other species that might be listening. He said, this is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth vessel Defiant, and I am here to tell the Krathon swarm something important. And he paused and then said, we are not running anymore, and not today, and not ever again. And to any species that can hear this message, remember that someone chose to fight back. Then he looked at Lieutenant Price and said, tactical. Bring us in and let us show them how humans fight. And the Defiant charged toward the swarm of bioships and against impossible odds, and one small ship against hundreds. But nobody on that bridge believed they would lose because they were human, and humans did not know how to quit. The Krathon bioships moved like a living wall of death toward the Defiant, and their weapons charged with sickly green light. And Jake Morrison watched them come and felt his heart pound, but kept his voice steady as he said, Lieutenant Price, execute. Attack pattern Alpha and hit them where they do not expect it. Megan Price's fingers flew across her tactical console, and she launched the first salvo of kinetic missiles from an angle 30 degrees off the standard attack vector, and the missiles streaked through space like silver bullets and slammed into the lead bioship before it could adapt its shields, and the impact tore through its organic hull, and the creature screamed across all frequencies as it died, and the other Krathon ships hesitated for just a moment, confused by the primitive weapons. That moment was all the Defiant needed, and Price said, firing railguns now, and the ship's kinetic cannons roared to life, sending solid metal slugs at a fraction of light speed, and they punched through two more bioships before the swarm could adjust. And Jake said, helm evasive pattern Delta, and do not let them get a lock on us, and the ship twisted and rolled through space like a dancer. Commander Alan Baker stood at Jake's side, coordinating shields and power distribution, and he said, Captain, their formation is breaking, and they are trying to surround us. And Jake said, good, and let them think they have us trapped, and then we punch through their weakest point. And Price found that weak point instantly, and said, targeting solution ready, and 3 bioships are clustered too close together, and 1 missile between them should cause a chain reaction. Jake said, fire. And Price launched a single heavy missile that detonated between the 3 Krathon ships, and the explosion was beautiful and terrible, as it consumed all 3, and turned them into expanding clouds of organic debris, and the crew cheered. But Jake knew this was just the beginning, because there were still over 100 bioships left, and the Defiant was just 1 vessel. Dr. Henry Cole's voice came over the comm from the science lab, and he said, Captain, I am reading the swarm's communication patterns, and they are confused by our tactics, and they keep trying to adapt, but we change our attack angles faster than they can compensate, and if we keep this up, we might actually survive this. Sergeant Nina Ortiz appeared on the bridge in full combat armor, and she said, Captain, sensors show Krathon landing organisms on the planet's surface, and they are starting ground assaults on the major cities, and if we want to evacuate anyone, we need to do it now before they overrun the spaceports. Jake made a decision in seconds and said, Sergeant, take your Marines and 2 shuttles and get as many Veilers off that planet as you can, and prioritize the leadership and the scientists, and anyone who carries knowledge we cannot afford to lose. And Ortiz nodded and said, yes, sir, and we will bring them home. The Defiant moved into a lower orbit, drawing fire from dozens of bioships, while Ortiz and her Marines launched toward the surface, and the ship shook with each impact against the shields, and Commander Baker said shields at 60%. And we cannot take much more of this, and Jake said we just need to buy time for the evacuation. On the planet's surface, Nina Ortiz and her 24 Marines hit the ground running in the capital city, where Veilor civilians fled in panic through streets filled with smoke and fire, and the Krathon ground forces were like giant insects made of black metal with blades for limbs and acid for blood, and they cut through everything in their path. Ortiz saw a group of Veilor children trapped in a collapsed building, and she did not hesitate, and she ran toward them, firing her rifle at the Krathon creatures, and her Marines followed, and they formed a defensive perimeter, while 2 Marines pulled the children free, and the Veilors looked at the humans with wonder, because nobody had come to help them, and everyone else had fled or died. A Veilor elder with robes marked with symbols of authority approached Ortiz and said in broken English, "You came, and we thought no one would come." And Ortiz said, "We are here now, and we need to get you to the spaceport." And the elder said, "The archives, and we must save the archives, and they contain 10,000 years of collected knowledge." Ortiz spoke into her comm and said, "Captain, we have a situation, and the Veilors have data archives that might be important." And Jake's voice came back steady and said, "Sergeant, get those archives and get those people, and we will hold the line up here as long as it takes." Back in orbit, the Defiant fought like nothing the Krathon had ever encountered, and Lieutenant Price used every trick she knew, and fired from impossible angles, and used the planet's gravity to slingshot missiles, and even rammed one bioship with the Defiant's reinforced prow when she ran out of other options, and the ship cut through the organic vessel like a knife, and came out the other side trailing debris. But the cost was mounting, and Dr. Cole reported casualties in engineering where a power conduit had exploded, and Commander Baker's tactical display showed shields failing across multiple sections, and the hull was breached in 3 places, and Jake knew they could not keep this up much longer. Then something unexpected happened, and a Veilor defense ship that everyone thought was destroyed limped out from behind the planet's moon, and its captain sent a message saying, "The humans shame us with their courage, and we will fight beside them." And the Veilor ship was old and battered, but it opened fire on the Krathon with everything it had. Jake felt a surge of hope, and he said, "Commander Baker, coordinate our attacks with the Veilor ship and let us show the swarm what cooperation looks like." And the 2 ships fought together, using the Defiant's speed and the Veilor ship's heavy shields, and they carved through the bioship formation like a blade. On the surface, Ortiz and her Marines fought their way to the archives building, where Veilor scholars had stored data crystals containing thousands of years of knowledge, and the Marines loaded crates of crystals onto hover sleds, while holding off wave after wave of Krathon ground forces, and 3 Marines died, buying time for the others, and Ortiz said their names quietly, promising to remember them. The elder helped load the final crate and said this knowledge could save the galaxy if anyone lives long enough to use it. And Ortiz said, "Then we better make sure someone does." And she called for extraction, and the shuttles came down through fire and smoke and loaded 50,000 Veilor civilians in the precious archives. But as the shuttles lifted off, a massive Krathon bioship broke from the orbital battle and dove toward the surface, targeting the evacuation. And Jake saw it coming, and he made another impossible decision, and he said, "Helm, put us between that bioship and those shuttles." And Price said, "Captain, that will leave us exposed." And Jake said, "I know, and do it anyway." The Defiant positioned itself directly in the path of the massive bioship and took the full force of its weapons, and the shields collapsed instantly, and the hull screamed as organic weapons tore through it, and alarms blared across every deck. And Baker shouted, "We have hull breaches on decks 3 through 7, and we have lost main power to weapons." But the shuttles made it through, and they docked with the Defiant, carrying their precious cargo of Veilor refugees and knowledge. And Ortiz reported all civilians secured, and Jake said, "Helm, get us out of here, and use whatever power we have left." And the ship limped away from Veilor Prime, trailing atmosphere and debris. The Krathon ships pursued, But something strange happened, and they suddenly stopped as if receiving new orders, and they turned back to finish consuming Valor Prime, and Jake did not understand why they let the Defiant go. But he was not going to question their luck. Dr. Cole came to the bridge looking exhausted and said, "Captain, I have been analyzing the swarm's behavior, and I think they let us go because we are not a threat, and we are just one damaged ship, and they probably think we will die anyway, and..." Jake said, "Then they do not know humans very well because we are just getting started." Commander Baker showed Jake the casualty reports, and 22 crew members were dead, and 40 more injured, and the ship was barely holding together, and they had maybe enough power to limp to the nearest safe harbor. And Baker said, "Captain, we did something impossible today, but I do not think we can do it again." Jake looked at his battered crew and his ruined ship and the frightened Valor refugees they had saved, and he said, "Alan, we are not going to do it again." And he paused and said, "We are going to do something even more impossible, and we are going to end this war." Then the communications officer said, "Captain, I am picking up multiple signals, and they are human ships, and they heard your broadcast, and they are asking for your location." And Jake felt something he had not felt in years, and it was hope spreading like wildfire, and he said, "Send them our coordinates and tell them Captain Jake Morrison says it is time to stop running." 6 human ships appeared on sensors, and they had all defied orders just like the Defiant, and they had all decided that some things were worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. And Jake smiled for the first time in months, and said, "Lieutenant Price, when those ships arrive, I want you to teach them everything we learned today about fighting the swarm." And Price said, "Yes, sir, and it will be my pleasure." The graveyard stretched across 3 star systems, and it held the remains of a super fleet that had tried to reach the Krathon Nexus 5 years ago, and failed, and hundreds of massive warships from a dozen species drifted like monuments to futility. And Jake Morrison looked at the wreckage and felt his confidence waver, because these had been the best ships and the best crews the galaxy had to offer, and they had all died here. Captain Lisa Grant's voice came over the comm, and she said, "Morrison, this is what happens when you fight the swarm with conventional tactics, and we are not doing that, and we are doing something they have never seen before, and remember that." And Jake appreciated her words, but the sight of so much death still chilled him to his core. Lieutenant Megan Price navigated the Defiant through the debris field, and she said, "Captain, I am reading power signatures ahead, and something is still active in this graveyard." And Dr. Henry Cole scanned the anomaly and said it appears to be an automated distress beacon from one of the command ships, and it has been broadcasting for 5 years with no one left alive to hear it. Commander Alan Baker said we should investigate, and there might be useful data in that ship's computers and tactical information about the swarm. And Jake agreed, and said, "Captain Grant, continue with the main fleet and we will catch up." And the Defiant broke formation to approach the dead command ship. The vessel was massive, and it had belonged to a species called the Torvan, who had been legendary warriors, and their ship was called Inevitable Victory, which now seemed like a cruel joke. And Sergeant Nina Ortiz led a boarding party with Dr. Cole to search for the ship's data core. Inside the dead ship, the corridors were dark and cold, and bodies floated in zero gravity preserved by the vacuum. And Ortiz saw Torvan warriors still in their armor, frozen in their final moments of desperate fighting, and she said quietly, "They died hard and they died fighting, and that counts for something." Dr. Cole found the data core and downloaded everything, and when he reviewed the logs back on the Defiant, he discovered something that made his hands shake, and he called Jake to the science lab and said, "Captain, the Torvan almost succeeded, and they made it within 10,000 kilometers of the Nexus before they were overwhelmed." Jake studied the tactical data and said what stopped them, and Cole said they used standard fleet tactics and they tried to fight their way through in a straight line, and the swarm kept adapting to their weapons and their formations, and eventually, the swarm just had more ships than the Torvan had ammunition. Cole pulled up another file and said, "But there is more, and the Torvan discovered something about the Nexus before they died, and it is not just a command center, and it is also a prison." And Cole showed Jake images of something ancient and terrible, and he said the Krathon were not always a plague, and they were once a peaceful species until something changed them. Jake looked at the data and felt a chill, and he said what changed them, and Cole said, "I am not certain, but the Torvan believed the Nexus itself is the source of the transformation, and if we destroy it, we might be freeing the Krathon as much as stopping them." And Jake said, "Then we have even more reason to finish this." The fleet reached the border of Krathon Prime space after 8 days of travel, and what they saw made even the bravest warriors feel fear, because the sky was filled with bioships, and thousands of them moved in patterns that looked like a living nightmare. And at the center of it all was the Nexus, and it was a structure the size of a small moon that pulsed with sick light. Captain Grant said, "Morrison, please tell me you have a brilliant plan, because I am looking at impossible odds here." And Jake said the plan is simple, and we hit them with everything we have, and we make them think we are trying to fight through to the Nexus, and while they are focused on the fleet, my strike team will use a captured bioship to infiltrate. Commander Pete Shaw said that is the worst plan I have ever heard, and I love it. And when do we start? And Jake said, give us 2 hours to get into position, and then light them up and make it loud. The strike team consisted of Jake and Commander Baker and Lieutenant Price and Dr. Cole and Sergeant Ortiz and Commander Shaw, and they boarded a Krathon bioship that Cole had managed to reprogram, and the ship was alive, and its walls pulsed with organic tissue, and it made Jake's skin crawl. But it was their only chance. The main fleet jumped in exactly 2 hours later, and they came in firing everything they had, and Captain Grant coordinated the attack using every trick Price had taught them, and the Krathon forces reacted exactly as predicted, and they swarmed toward the fleet, leaving gaps in their defensive perimeter. The captured bioship slipped through one of those gaps, and Cole piloted it, using the Krathon control interface, and the enemy ships ignored them because they thought it was one of their own. And Jake watched the main battle on sensors and saw ships dying, and he forced himself not to think about the people he was sending to their deaths. Inside the Nexus, the walls were made of living tissue that pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat, and the corridors twisted in ways that hurt to look at, and Dr. Cole led them deeper, using his xenobiology knowledge to navigate the organic structure. And he said the central core should be 3 kilometers ahead. They encountered Krathon defenders, and these were not like the drones outside, and these were smarter and faster, and they moved with purpose, and Sergeant Ortiz's Marines fought them in brutal close-quarters combat, and the creatures bled acid that burned through armor, and 3 Marines died in the first engagement. Lieutenant Price calculated their route and said, "If we keep this pace, we will never reach the core before reinforcements arrive, and we need a faster way." And Commander Shaw said, "What if we use the Nexus itself? And these organic conduits must connect to the core, and we could cut through directly." Dr. Cole said that is dangerous because we do not know what is inside those conduits, but Jake said, "We do not have time for safe." And Cole cut into one of the pulsing organic tubes, and inside was a flow of nutrient fluid, and they could see it led deeper into the structure. They swam through the organic conduit, and it was horrifying because the walls contracted around them like they were being digested. And Commander Baker said, "I am going to have nightmares about this for the rest of my life, assuming we survive the next hour." Outside, the main fleet was taking heavy casualties, and Captain Grant's carrier Horizon had lost half its fighter wings, and Commander Shaw's destroyer Valiant was barely holding together. And Grant sent a message to Jake saying, "Morrison, we cannot hold much longer, and whatever you are doing in there, do it fast." The strike team emerged from the conduit into a massive chamber, and at its center was something that defied description, and it was part organic and part machine, and it pulsed with intelligence and malevolence, and Dr. Cole said that is the Nexus core, and that is what controls the entire swarm. But then Price said, "Captain, we have a problem, and look at those conduits." And she pointed to thousands of organic tubes connecting to the core, and she said, "The neural disruptor has to be placed at the exact center, or the signal will not propagate through the entire network." Jake looked at the distance and said, "That is at least a kilometer of open space with no cover, and the moment we move toward it, the Nexus will know we are here." And Cole said, "Worse than that, and someone will have to stay with the device to ensure it detonates properly, and the timer mechanism will not work in this environment." The team looked at each other, and they all knew what that meant, and someone was not going home, and Commander Baker stepped forward and said, "I will do it, and I am the first officer, and this is my responsibility." And Jake said, "No, Alan and I am the captain, and this is my call." Baker pulled his sidearm and pointed it at Jake, not to shoot, but to make a point, and he said, "Jake, you started this rebellion, and you inspired the galaxy to fight back, and they need you alive to finish what you started, and I am just a man who wants to make his death count for something." Jake wanted to argue, but he saw the determination in Baker's eyes, and he knew his friend had made up his mind. And Baker said, "Tell my family I love them, and tell them I died stopping the monsters." And Jake said, "I promise, Alan, and I will make sure everyone knows what you did here." The team laid down covering fire while Baker ran toward the core carrying the neural disruptor. And the Nexus realized what was happening and it sent wave after wave of defenders, but Baker kept running, and he was hit twice, but his armor held, and he made it to the center and he placed the device against the core. Baker's voice came over the comm one last time and he said, "It has been an honor serving with you all, and Jake, get everyone out of here because this is going to be spectacular." And then he activated the neural disruptor. The team ran back through the conduits while behind them the device began to charge, and they could hear Baker singing an old Earth song about going home, and his voice was steady, even though he knew he was about to die. And Sergeant Ortiz had tears streaming down her face. As they fled, they made it back to the bioship, and Cole got the engines online, and they launched just as the neural disruptor reached full power, and the explosion was not fire or force, but pure energy that cascaded through the Nexus's neural network, and the organic structure began to scream. Outside, every single Krathon bioship froze in place and their weapons powered down, and their organic hulls went slack and the fleet stopped. The silence across the galaxy was deafening, and for 3 years the sound of war had been constant, with ships burning and worlds screaming and the Krathon swarm consuming everything. But now there was only quiet, and across 1,000 systems, the bioships drifted dead and empty, and species that had been fighting for survival suddenly found themselves alive and victorious. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiant and watched the sensor readings confirm what seemed impossible. And every Krathon vessel in the galaxy had gone dark, and the hive mind network had collapsed completely, and the war was over. But the price had been terrible, and Commander Alan Baker was gone, and so many others had died to reach this moment. Captain Lisa Grant's voice came over the fleet-wide channel, and she said, "All ships report in and give me casualty figures and damage assessments," and one by one the captains responded. And the Horizon had lost 60% of its fighter wings, and Commander Shaw's Valiant was venting atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches, and every ship had taken damage, and every crew had lost people, but they were alive, and they had won. Lieutenant Megan Price worked her tactical console and said, "Captain, I am picking up transmissions from all over the galaxy, and species are reporting that the swarm has stopped everywhere." And she looked at Jake with tears in her eyes and said, "We actually did it, and we saved everyone." Dr. Henry Cole came to the bridge looking exhausted, and he said, "Captain, I have been analyzing the Krathon bioships, and they are not all dead, and some of them are showing signs of individual consciousness, and I think when we destroyed the Nexus, we freed them from the hive mind." And Cole pulled up scans showing Krathon drones moving independently and without coordination, and he said they are confused and frightened, but they are no longer controlled. Sergeant Nina Ortiz organized recovery teams to search the damaged sections of the Defiant, and she found 12 crew members trapped in a sealed compartment, and she personally cut through the bulkhead to free them. And when they thanked her, she said, "We take care of our own, and that is what makes us human." The fleet limped back toward civilized space, and it took them 3 weeks because so many ships were damaged, and along the way they encountered other vessels from dozens of species, and every one of them had heard the story of the human fleet that refused to surrender, and they called Jake Morrison a hero, and he hated that word because heroes did not get their friends killed. When they finally reached Valor Prime, they found the planet scarred but healing, and the Valors had begun rebuilding their cities. And when Jake's shuttle landed, he was met by Elder Voran, who embraced him in the Valor way with all 4 arms, and said, "Human Captain, you gave us our future back, and we will never forget what you and your people sacrificed." Jake attended a memorial service for Commander Alan Baker and the other crew members who had died, and he stood before a crowd of humans and aliens, and he said Alan Baker was a good man who believed in duty and honor, and he gave his life so that billions could live, and I will carry his memory until the day I die. And everyone there knew Jake meant every word. Dr. Sophie Kim had been coordinating with survivors across the galaxy, and she told Jake that the Galactic Council wanted to reform, and they wanted humanity to have a seat at the table, and not just any seat, but a permanent position on the Security Council. And Jake said, "I am just a ship captain and I do not know anything about politics." And Kim smiled and said, "You united the galaxy through action, and that is better than any politics." Earth Command finally made contact after weeks of silence, and they had been preparing for a last stand around Sol that never came. And the Admiral who had ordered the retreat called Jake personally and said, "Captain Morrison, you disobeyed direct orders and you should be court-martialed. But instead I am recommending you for the highest honors because you saved humanity, and probably every other species too." Jake said, "With respect, Admiral, I do not want honors, and I want the people who died to be remembered, and I want their families taken care of, and I want the galaxy to know that ordinary people did extraordinary things." And the Admiral said, "Consider it done, and Jake, you are being promoted to Admiral whether you like it or not, because we need leaders like you." 6 months passed, and the galaxy slowly healed, and worlds that had been consumed were being reclaimed, and species that had been refugees were going home, and humanity's reputation had changed overnight from newcomers to saviors, and everywhere humans went, they were welcomed and honored. The Defiant underwent extensive repairs and was given upgraded systems and a new crew to replace those who had fallen. And Lieutenant Megan Price was promoted to captain and given command of the ship, and she stood on the bridge where she had served under Jake, and she promised herself she would live up to his example. Dr. Henry Cole chose not to return to weapons research, and instead he worked with the freed Krathon drones, helping them adjust to individual consciousness and teaching them peaceful ways. And he said to Jake one day that perhaps some good could come from all the death if they could give these creatures a second chance. Sergeant Nina Ortiz became the head of a new multi-species military training program, and she taught young warriors from dozens of civilizations how to fight together and how to protect rather than destroy, and her students called her the Iron Sergeant, and she wore the name with pride. Dr. Sophie Kim was appointed as humanity's first galactic ambassador, and she traveled to countless worlds speaking about cooperation and unity, and she always told the story of the human fleet that refused to give up, and how one species' stubborn courage had inspired everyone else. Admiral Jake Morrison stood at the dedication ceremony on Valor Prime, where they were unveiling a memorial to those who died stopping the swarm, and Commander Alan Baker's name was carved first on the list of heroes, and beside it were the names of thousands of others, both human and alien, who had sacrificed everything. Vorin the Valor Elder approached Jake and said, "We have a saying in our language that translates roughly as those who stand when others flee become the pillars upon which civilizations are built, and you and your people are those pillars, Admiral." And Jake said, "We just did what needed to be done," and Vorin said, "Yes, and that is what makes it heroic." Jake visited Earth for the first time in over a year, and he went to Commander Baker's family personally, and he gave them Alan's personal effects and his medals, and he told them everything about how their husband and father had died saving the galaxy, and Baker's wife held Jake's hand and said, "Thank you for bringing him back to us, even if only in memory." And Jake said he was the bravest man I ever knew. Standing in front of the memorial, Jake thought about all the people who had believed in him when he made the impossible choice to help the Valors, and he thought about how one small act of defiance had sparked a movement that saved trillions of lives, and he wondered if they had known what they were starting when they turned the Defiant toward Valor Prime instead of Earth. A young human officer approached Jake and said, "Admiral, we have received a distress call from the frontier, and a colony is under attack by pirates, and they are requesting assistance." And Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, and he said, "Prepare a ship and we leave in 1 hour." The officer looked surprised and said, "Sir, you do not have to go personally, and we have other ships that can respond." And Jake said, "Son, I learned a long time ago that when someone needs help, you do not send someone else, and you go yourself, and you do what needs to be done." Jake walked through the memorial one last time, reading the names of the fallen, and he stopped at Commander Baker's name, and he said quietly, "Alan, I am still buying you that drink someday when I join you. But until then, I will keep fighting, and I will keep helping people because that is what you taught me." He boarded his shuttle and looked back at the memorial and the rebuilt cities of Valor Prime, and the ships from a dozen species working together in orbit, and he thought about how much had changed in 6 months, and how humanity had gone from being told to hide and wait for death to being the species that stood up and said, "Not today." The shuttle lifted off, and Jake looked down at the planet below and then up at the stars ahead, and somewhere out there someone needed help, and he would answer that call, just like he always had, and just like he always would, because that was what humans did, and they helped and they fought, and they never gave up no matter how bad the odds looked. Lieutenant Price's voice came over the comm, and she said, "Admiral, the ship is ready, and we are waiting for your orders." And Jake smiled and said, "Captain Price, set course for the colony, and maximum speed, and let us go see what we can do." The ship jumped to hyperspace, and behind it, Valor Prime continued to heal, and across the galaxy, species worked together to rebuild what had been lost. And on Earth, Young people looked up at the stars and dreamed of joining the fleet and making a difference. And everywhere humans went, they carried with them the lesson they had taught the galaxy. That lesson was simple and profound, and it would echo through history for generations to come, and it was this: when darkness threatens and all hope seems lost and everyone else has given up, sometimes all it takes is one person or one crew or one species to stand up and fight back and say with absolute conviction and unshakable determination those two simple words that changed everything. The asteroid field became their sanctuary, and it was hidden deep in neutral space where the Krathon swarm had not yet reached, and Jake Morrison stood in what passed for a command center, watching more ships arrive every day, and each one brought more humans who had heard his broadcast and decided to fight rather than hide. And within 2 weeks they had gathered 37 vessels ranging from military frigates to converted cargo haulers, and it was not much compared to the fleets that had already fallen, but it was a start. Captain Lisa Grant arrived commanding a carrier called Horizon, and she was 45 with steel-gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude, and she brought a full wing of fighters and pilots who knew how to use them. And she walked up to Jake and said, "I heard you were planning something crazy, Morrison, and I figured you could use some proper air support." And Jake shook her hand and said, "Crazy seems to be all we have left, Grant." Commander Pete Shaw commanded a destroyer named Valiant, and he was 37 and had a reputation for being hot-headed. But his crew loved him, and his ship could take punishment and keep fighting. And he said to Jake, "The way I see it, we are already dead if we run, so we might as well die doing something that matters." And Jake said, "I am glad you see it that way, because what I am about to propose might actually get us killed." The Valor elders had been studying their rescued archives, and they called a meeting with all the human captains, and the lead elder, whose name was Voran, spoke in halting English and said, "We have discovered something in our oldest records, and the Krathon swarm is not just a mindless plague, and they have a central intelligence and a nexus that controls every bioship across the galaxy." And Voran pulled up a holographic map showing Krathon space and a single point deep in their territory. And he said, "If you destroy the nexus, you destroy the swarm." The room went silent, and Captain Grant said, "That is suicide. And Krathon core space has never been penetrated, and every fleet that tried was destroyed." And Commander Shaw said, "So, what you are saying is, nobody has succeeded yet, and that just means we get to be the first." Dr. Henry Cole had been working with a Valor scientist, and together they had been developing something new, and Cole stood up and said, "The Nexus coordinates all swarm activity through a neural network, and if we can disrupt that network, the entire swarm will collapse, and I have designed a weapon specifically for this purpose." And he displayed schematics for what he called a neural disruptor. Lieutenant Megan Price studied the design and said, "Doctor, this is brilliant, but it requires exotic materials we do not have." And Cole nodded and said, "The materials exist only in Krathon-controlled space, and we will need to raid one of their supply depots to obtain them." Commander Alan Baker, who had become Jake's most trusted advisor, said, "Even if we get the materials and build this weapon, how do we deliver it? And the Nexus will be protected by thousands of bioships, and we have less than 40 vessels." And Jake said, "Then we make them think we are going somewhere else, and we hit them where they are not looking." A new voice spoke up, and it belonged to Dr. Sophie Kim, who was 31 and had been rescued from a refugee transport, and she was a xenolinguist who could speak 17 languages. And she said, "Captain, I have been coordinating with survivors from other species, and there are scattered resistance groups throughout the galaxy, and if we can unite them, we might have a chance." And Jake said, "Doctor, I am putting you in charge of communications and reach out to everyone you can find." Over the next month, the hidden fleet prepared, and Lieutenant Price trained the captains and crews in human tactics, and she taught them how to fight unpredictably and use the swarm's adaptation delay against them. And she ran simulation after simulation until every pilot knew their role by heart. And the alien refugees who watched the training were amazed by human determination. Sergeant Nina Ortiz trained mixed-species Marine units, and she taught Valor and human soldiers how to fight together in close quarters, and she was tough but fair, and the Valors respected her because she had risked everything to save their people. And one young Valor warrior asked her why humans fought so hard for others, and Ortiz said, "Because somebody has to, and it might as well be us." The day came to raid the Krathon supply depot, and Jake assembled a strike force of 12 ships including the Defiant, and they jumped into swarm territory using captured Krathon identification codes that Dr. Cole had decrypted, and they came. out of hyperspace near a massive organic structure that pulsed with energy. The depot was defended by 30 bioships, but the human strike force hit them with everything they had learned, and Price's tactics worked perfectly, and they struck from 6 directions at once using kinetic weapons and unpredictable attack patterns, and the swarm forces could not adapt fast enough. Captain Grant's fighters screamed through the depot's exterior, grabbing containers of the exotic materials they needed, while the capital ships kept the bioships occupied, and Commander Shaw's destroyer, Valiant, took massive damage when 3 bioships focused their fire on it, but Shaw refused to retreat and he kept fighting until the fighters were clear. They lost 2 ships in the raid, and 96 crew members died, but they got the materials and they jumped away before Krathon reinforcements could arrive. And Jake stood on the bridge of the Defiant, looking at the casualty reports and feeling the weight of every lost life, and Commander Baker put a hand on his shoulder and said they knew the risks, Jake, and they chose to be here. Back at the asteroid base, Dr. Cole and his team worked day and night to construct the neural disruptor, and it took 3 weeks, but finally they had it, and the weapon looked like nothing special, just a cylinder about 2 meters long filled with circuitry and exotic matter, but Cole said this will end the war if we can get it to the Nexus. Dr. Kim's outreach had been successful, and scattered alien resistance groups had been making contact, and a few brave ships from other species started arriving at the hidden base, including 3 warships from different civilizations. And they said they had been inspired by human courage and were ready to fight. Jake called a final briefing with all the captains, and he pulled up the tactical map showing the route to Krathon Prime Space. And he said, "This is a one-way trip for most of us, and the Nexus is protected by more firepower than any of us have ever seen, and our job is simple, and we create a distraction big enough to let a small strike team infiltrate and deliver the neural disruptor." He looked around the room at faces both human and alien and said, "I will lead the strike team myself, and I need volunteers who understand they probably will not come back." And immediately Lieutenant Price stepped forward and said, "I am with you." Captain and Dr. Cole said you will need me to calibrate the device, and Sergeant Ortiz said somebody has to watch your backs. And Commander Baker sighed and said, "You are not doing this without me, Jake." Commander Shaw volunteered and said, "My ship is fast and I can get you in close," and Captain Grant said the fleet will need someone to coordinate the diversion, and I am the best qualified, and she looked at Jake and said, "Make it count, Morrison, because we are putting everything on the line for this." The Valor Elder Voran approached Jake privately and said, "Human Captain, you have given my people hope when we had none, and you have shown the galaxy that resistance is possible. And whatever happens at Krathon Prime, you have already won because you taught us how to fight back." Jake spent the night before the mission walking through the asteroid base and talking to crew members, and he saw humans and Valors working side by side, and he saw pilots from 3 different species practicing formation flying, and he saw Dr. Kim teaching alien refugees how to say thank you in English. And he realized that even if they failed tomorrow, they had already accomplished something impossible. Lieutenant Price found him standing alone looking at the stars, and she said, "Captain, are you ready for this?" And Jake said honestly, "Megan, I am terrified, but that has never stopped me before." And Price smiled and said, "Good, because if you were not scared, I would think you were crazy." The morning came and the fleet prepared to jump, and 43 ships from multiple species all ready to face impossible odds, and Jake stood on the bridge of the Defiant surrounded by his crew, and he said, "Helm set course for Krathon Prime Space, and let us go end this war." Dr. Kim sent out a final broadcast to every surviving civilization in the galaxy, and she said, "If you can hear this message, humanity and its allies are making their stand, and we go to destroy the swarm's heart. And whatever happens next, remember that someone chose to fight, and someone said not today to the darkness." The fleet jumped into hyperspace, and Jake knew that millions of beings across the galaxy were listening and hoping and praying, and he thought about all the worlds that had fallen and all the people who had died, and he made a promise to their memory that this sacrifice would mean something. Commander Baker stood beside him and said, "Jake, I just want you to know that defying orders that day at Valor Prime was the best decision I ever made." And Jake said, "Alan, when this is over, I am buying you a drink." And Baker laughed and said, "You better survive then, because I am going to hold you to that." The journey to Krathon space took 6 days, and they passed through systems that were graveyards of entire civilizations, and they saw planets that had been stripped of all life, and ships that had been torn apart, and